When the Middle Eastern theatre of World War I came to a close in 1918, the Ottoman Empire's fate would be decided by the victorious Allies. In no mood to be conciliatory, the Allies were intent on dividing the Ottoman territories between them. The Sultan, forced to accept these conditions, would be provided a small state in central Anatolia. But a burgeoning nationalist resistance movement under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal refused to accept the Allies' plans for Anatolia. Despite having to fight wars on 3 different fronts against various opponents, the Turkish nationalists were unwilling to compromise on their nation's sovereignty. For them, this was a war of independence, and in the end, their determination would pay off. Before World War I had even finished, the Allied powers had designs on splitting the Ottoman territory in the Middle East amongst them. In the aftermath of the war, the Sykes-Picot Agreement between Britain and France in 1916 was broadly enacted to give control of Syria to the French, whilst the British were allocated Palestine, Transjordan and Iraq. Similar plans were made for Anatolia, the Ottoman heartland. In the east, there was to be an independent Armenia, as well as a potential Kurdish state, and much of the southeastern quarter of it would come under French influence. Whilst in the west, eastern Thrace and territory around Izmir was given to Greece. At the same time, much of western Anatolia fell under the influence of Italy, and Istanbul and the Dardanelles Straits became a demilitarized zone under international control. Across Anatolia, all Ottoman military units were to lay down their weapons and demobilize. It's within this context that Mustafa Kemal arrived in Istanbul towards the end of 1918. Witnessing the city's occupation by the Allies, he was not alone in harboring resentment towards the foreign military presence on Turkish territory. Throughout Anatolia, Ottoman army units refused to demobilize, and local paramilitary groups were being formed to resist the occupation. The local resistance worried the Allies so much that they pressured the Ottoman government to restore order. Mustafa would get his chance to act when he was dispatched at the head of the Third Army by the Sultan to crush these uprisings. In this role, he was given considerable power to restore the defunct authority of the Ottoman state. But the Sultan's authority was a facade. Most Turks were aware that by this point, he had been reduced to a puppet by the Allies. Mustafa was well aware of this too. So when he landed with his army at Samsun on the Black Sea coast in May 1919, he immediately set about to initiate his plan of ending the foreign presence on Turkish land. Having resigned from the Ottoman army, he was dismissed by the government and orders for his arrest were issued. Among the military class, he was not alone in supporting the resistance. General Kazim Karabekir had refused the British order to demobilize his 15th Army in eastern Anatolia. Mustafa subsequently linked up with Karabekir in the eastern city of Erzurum, where the Turkish nationalist movement held a congress. There it was decided that due to his competence and commitment to the cause, Mustafa Kemal was to be the leader of the resistance. The Erzurum Congress also produced the Misaki Milli, the National Pact, which set out the aims of the nationalist movement. The pact revolved largely around the issue of sovereignty, affirming that the frontiers of the Turkish nation were inviolable, and that its independence was to be upheld against foreign occupation. In keeping with the focus on sovereignty, the National Pact also revoked the Ottoman capitulations. Historically, these were economic concessions that the Sultan had made to certain European powers, but by the 19th century, they had evolved into an instrument of imperialism, and were even stretched to include the exemption of the empire's non-Muslim subjects from Ottoman law. Given the prominence of nationalist ideas, as well as the religious tensions that had been exacerbated when the Ottoman Empire's Balkan territories broke away, considerations of the religious and ethnic makeup of a post-war Turkey were crucial for the Turkish nationalists. Later that year in 1919, the Turkish nationalist movement and the Ottoman government agreed to uphold the National Pact, and the general election was called. Dominated by nationalists associated with the resistance, the newly elected parliament was to be convened early in 1920. But the Allies stepped in. Seeing their position was threatened, they dissolved the parliament and forced the Sultan to convene a government that was hostile to the nationalist movement. It was in this time that İsmet İnönü and Fevzi Çakmak fled Istanbul and joined the nationalist resistance. Mustafa Kemal and his associates now felt compelled to form the Grand National Assembly at Ankara in the Anatolian interior, far from the reach of the Allies. Kemal was elected as its president, and it still remains the legislative body of Turkey to this day. In the summer of 1920, the Allies signed the Treaty of Sevres, officially carving up the Ottoman realm. Kemal and his cohorts immediately declared it invalid and as an affront to Turkish sovereignty, so they set about to overturn the treaty stipulations by force, seeking to expel the Greeks from Anatolia and Thrace, whilst annexing territory from the nascent Armenian state in the east. With the latter aim, they had enthusiastic support from the Bolsheviks of Russia, who were engaged in their own civil war at the time. The Bolsheviks sought to partition the new Armenian state between themselves and Kemal's nationalists. So during the course of the Turkish War of Independence, they sent vital supplies of gold and armaments to Kemal's forces. By December 1920, General Karabekir's forces had recaptured most of the territory in the South Caucasus that had been under Ottoman control prior to the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878. With the Armenians no longer being a problem, Kemal could now focus on the Western Front with the Greeks. Already throughout 1920, the Turks had fought and defeated the French, who incorporated large numbers of Armenians into their army on the Cilician Front in the south. The fighting with the Greeks was the most intense of the war. With British backing, Greece had expanded its Anatolian territories further inland after a summer and autumn offensive in 1920. But with the conclusion of hostilities on the eastern and southern fronts, the Turks could focus all their energy on pushing Greece out of Anatolia. Kemal's forces won a key victory at the First Battle of İnönü in January 1921, after his right-hand man İsmet İnönü had reorganized the irregular militias into a disciplined army. Still, the Greeks made a concerted effort to push their advance further east during their 1921 summer offensive. At the Battle of Kütahya Eskişehir, the Greeks broke through the Turkish lines of resistance and forced them to withdraw beyond the Sakarya River. This was the last line of defense for the Turkish nationalists. Kemal's government in Ankara was now in existential danger. Seeing the dismal situation, the Grand National Assembly replaced İnönü with Mustafa Kemal as commander-in-chief of the Turkish forces. At the pivotal Battle of Sakarya, fighting raged on for 3 weeks in August and September along a battle line that stretched 100 kilometers. In the end, the Greeks were forced to give up on delivering the knockout blow and retreated further west beyond the Sakarya River. For the next year, a stalemate existed between the two sides. By now, divisions within the Allies were emerging. The French and Italians had already negotiated with the Turks, and there were even rumors that they were materially supporting the Turkish national movement. so they called for an armistice. But Kemal was aware that his side now held the strategic advantage, so he prepared for a final assault to expel the Greeks out of Anatolia. Termed as the Great Offensive, the Turkish army launched its biggest operation of the war. During August and September, the Greek army was completely defeated and pushed back to the Aegean Sea. The recapture of Izmir was a jubilant occasion for the Turkish army, but it was marred by the destruction that ensued in the days after its liberation. A fire broke out that blazed for more than a week, resulting in tens of thousands of deaths, mostly Greeks and Armenians. Who was responsible has not been determined, but many have pointed the finger at Turkish soldiers. With the Allies recognizing the changed political landscape, and the Turkish nationalists having achieved their major aims, an armistice was signed in October 1922 that brought about the end of hostilities. The issues of control over Eastern Thrace and Istanbul were handled without force, although the British did come close to attacking the Turkish nationalists. Despite their strategic victories, the British still expected Kemal's side to make some concessions in the post-war negotiations. To their alarm, İsmet İnönü, the Grand National Assembly's chosen representative, demanded the fulfillment of the National Pact. During the intense diplomacy at Lausanne, a treaty was finally reached in July 1923. The Republic of Turkey's sovereignty and the Grand National Assembly as its legitimate government were recognized by the international community. Turkish demands for the city of Mosul in Mesopotamia, based on the many Turks that lived there, were to be decided by the League of Nations later on in 1926, when Mustafa Kemal's government would renounce their claims in exchange for a 10% stake in Mosul's oil deposits. The straits around Istanbul were to be returned to Turkish control, but open to international commerce at all times. During the course of the negotiations, Greece and Turkey had realized that the two groups could no longer live together in cooperation, despite Muslims inhabiting Greece for 500 years and Greeks living in Anatolia for thousands of years. Subsequently, a population exchange took place which saw the transfer of almost 500,000 Muslims from Greece in exchange for 1.5 million Anatolian Greeks from Turkey. On October 29, 1923, the Republic of Turkey was declared, with Mustafa Kemal as its first president. A year before this, the Grand National Assembly had voted to abolish the Ottoman Sultanate in November 1922. Now, with independence assured, Kemal could work to enact a political vision for the Republic of Turkey that would give it a very different identity to its Ottoman predecessor. I want to thank my patrons for always supporting. If you want to financially support Hikmah History, there's a link to my Patreon in the description to this video. And don't forget to check out my second channel, Street Food Bites, for delicious food content. Until next time, peace!